So I did my undergraduate education studies at Dalhousie University, which is in Halifax, Nova Scotia. How many of you are from that part of the country? No. Whoa! Oh my, where? You went to school? Oh, awesome. Sweet. I have a kindred spirit. I love that city of Halifax. It's wonderful. Um, and somebody almost went there? Oh, okay. Okay. So I spent 4 years there, and one Thanksgiving weekend, I decided to go on a driving tour of Nova Scotia. I hopped into my car, and without packing too much in my car, I just headed out and started driving. And you can kind of do that in Nova Scotia. It's a little small, and you just kind of go and you drive. So, driving all day, I ended up in this quaint little town called Wolfville, Nova Scotia. And by that time, it was kind of getting pretty dark, and I was getting tired, so I pulled over to the side of the road. And because I'm a college student, don't have a whole lot of money, didn't have time, didn't have money to pay for any kind of accommodations, I just fell asleep in the car. Many of you have ever done that? So I slept in the car, I woke up, and in the morning I noticed an elderly man walking down the road towards my car. And I rolled down the window, and he came up to me and he says, is everything okay? And I was a little bit shocked because I thought, oh my goodness, I think I'm parked on his property. And I said, oh yeah, no, everything is fine. I just pulled over to the side of the road. I fell asleep here. I didn't want to pay for anything, hotel or something. So I'll be on my way. And he looks at me. And, well, in that case, you want to come in for a coffee? I go, okay, sure. All right, I'll come in for a coffee. Thank you for the invite. And so I walk into his house, and he takes me through the room and into the kitchen, and his wife sees this tall Asian guy walking through her house, and she's a little shocked what's going on. I was like, he invited me in here. And so I'm hanging out in his kitchen, and he says, okay, here's a coffee. He brews it up for me, and he says, oh, are you hungry? Yeah, I'm actually I can eat something. And he goes, well, do you like some eggs? And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll have some eggs. Oh, so there's some eggs in the refrigerator. Take it out, help yourself. Yeah, cook one for yourself. Oh, okay, sure. He says, oh, and while you're at it, cook one for me too. I like it over easy. And so here I'm at this guy's house, and I'm drinking coffee, and I'm flipping eggs, and we're having breakfast together. Wonderful breakfast morning, Thanksgiving morning. But that wasn't just it, right? So later on, he says, oh, so, are you hanging out? It's Thanksgiving, and if you're interested, you want to come to my church for worship? And I'm like, okay, sure. So he takes me to his church. We participate in a Thanksgiving service, and then he takes me to this historic building with English box pews. It's like 200 years old, and it's this historical landmark. And he takes me to this place and goes, "Oh, did you see this?" And he gives me the little history, and it's a really quaint little building. And there's this huge pulpit that you have to actually climb up several flights of stairs to get to, and there's this giant like what do you call it, soundboard, because it's, acoustic and stuff. So he goes, why don't you get up there and climb up there? And, are you sure? I said, yeah, just go up there. So I climb up there, and I'm standing in that church, and it's just really amazing. And so later on, after we're done, I'm ready to go, and he goes, oh, hey, what do you want to do for lunch? Do you have any plans? And I go, no plans. He goes, well, I have my son, his wife, and his kids. They're coming over from Halifax, and they're going to be having, we're going to have a barbecue. Do you want to stay for barbecue? And I go, okay, I can do barbecue. We're going to have hot dogs and hamburgers. Oh, yeah, that's fine. I like hot dogs and hamburgers. And he goes, can you grill them? Yeah, I can grill them, sure, no problem. So here I am spending the afternoon with his family, with his son and daughter, son and his wife and kids, and grilling hot dogs and hamburgers, enjoying wonderful hospitality. This is hospitality at its best. One of the best things, I think, that I've appreciated from my time in Halifax. Throughout the course of Jesus' ministry, Jesus sat at many, many tables. It's not uncommon for traveling prophets and evangelists in the first century to rely on the hospitality of local villagers and townspeople for their food and their lodging. And so it's no surprise that we encounter Jesus at the homes of so many different people throughout his life and ministry. In fact, if you read through most of the Gospels, it's amazing to find that most of Jesus' ministry happens in a house and around a table. Jesus was in Peter's mother-in-law's house when he healed her of her high fever. Jesus was teaching and preaching in someone's home when 4 friends decided to lower a friend through the roof so that Jesus could heal him. And you, of course, remember the famous story when Jesus invites himself into the home of this despised tax collector, Zacchaeus. And in that meal and in that encounter, Zacchaeus changes his life. Much of Jesus' ministry happens around a table and inside a home. In fact, Jesus' very first miracle was at a banqueting table. The bridegroom ran out of wine, and they were going to experience the public shame of this whole thing, and so, he changes water into wine. And of course, you remember it was at a table when he was reclining with his disciples that he gets up, takes off his outer garment, wraps a towel around his waist, kneels down, and washes his disciples' feet. Much of Jesus' ministry happens around the table. And what Jesus says and does at the table reflects something about the kingdom of God. And so we find Jesus at the home of a prominent Pharisee one Sabbath day. And after the Shabbat service was finished, this influential leader opens up his home, extends an invitation to his community, and he hosts a lavish luncheon. Most of the people gathered around that table was probably key members of the village, distinguished scholars, shrewd lawyers, savvy entrepreneurs, and other prominent professionals and stakeholders. This was a power luncheon with movers and shakers, power brokers, and the upwardly mobile. But just in case the optics might suggest that this might be some exclusive RSVP type event, the guest list included a man who was suffering from abnormal swelling in his body. Now, we don't know much about this man and how he ended up there. Maybe he was a friend of the host and he came because he actually wanted some healing from his edema. He heard that Jesus was a healer and he wanted to come. Or maybe this was a random person, somewhat co-opted by the host to see what Jesus would do. Would he heal on the Sabbath or not? Would he break the rules or not? Kind of a pawn in this legalistic game of chess. But regardless of how this man gets there, it's clear that the table that Jesus is sitting at is not a table of hospitality, but it's a table of hostility. And we know this because Jesus was being carefully watched, Luke describes. And the Greek word here literally means to be inspected alongside and to do so insidiously, looking for some moral failure or some error. And so really, essentially, Jesus was under the microscope. Every move scrutinized, every word being parsed, and he was kind of wanting to be there watching to see what he would do. Will he break the Sabbath law and heal this man, or will he keep the status quo? And so Jesus was sitting at a table of hostility and not hospitality. And we know this not by the fact that people were sizing Jesus up, but also by the fact that they were sizing one another up. Luke says that Jesus noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table. And the scene that Luke describes here is the table where guests were actually sizing one another up. Sizing up the competition, determining the pecking order, jockeying for the best seat in the house, the one closest to the table, Picking the places of honor was Luke's way of saying that both the guests and the host valued a culture of self-promotion. And they enjoyed the power and the status that their table politics created for themselves. This table was a table full of not companions, but of competitors. So this kind of table politics happens all the time because where you sit around the table matters. It matters to my kids. Every time we go to a restaurant, they fight over where they are seated relative to myself or my wife or a kid or where we are. I want to sit there. No, I want to sit next to Daddy. No, I want to sit next to Mom. My seat's better than your seat. I'm seating right behind the side or between Mommy and Daddy. This table politics. It happens at a very young age. Those of you who have kids probably can attest to that fact. But table politics happens at a young age. It continues, again, throughout life. Walk through any high school cafeteria and you'll know where you seat. It matters. I work as a chaplain at a youth custody center, and the first thing that I noticed when I started my work there is you would enter into a unit and there'd be kids, living all together, and there's tables where they sit to eat, and there's a lounge area where there's TV where they can hang out. But when it's time to have a meal, whether it's a lunch or breakfast or dinner, it was interesting how they organized themselves and where they sat. And you can actually notice when there's a new kid that's brought into the unit, you could see and feel the tension kind of rising. Where's this kid going to sit? Is he going to sit in that table or is he going to sit on this table? And you can kind of feel the energy. Who's going to have to renegotiate? Who's going to be on top and who's on the bottom? And, it's stressful living in an environment like that, always having to jockey for position and for a place at the table. But, that's the world that we live in. Because the table is no longer a table of hospitality, but rather of business and personal advancement. There was this article several years ago, and it was an article that recounted some advice that billionaire real estate mogul Li Ka-shing had for some young entrepreneurs and people who want to get ahead in their life. And some of the advice is really good, some very practical stuff like, save your money. It's a good thing. It's a good idea. Or spend less on your clothes. That's a kind of good one. That's very good. And invest in your education. Make sure that you put money aside and continue to grow. Invest in your education. That's really good stuff. But the thing that really stuck out to me when I was reading this article was how he says that it's important to buy lunch for people more important than you. And I'll throw up the quote there for you guys to follow along. He says this. Is it there? The notes are falling. Can you pull it up? Not that one, the Li Ka-shing one. Oh, thanks. Thank you. All right. Nope. Back. There we go. All right, let me find my place here. All right. Why don't you all read it while I get my notes all settled up? Go ahead. All right. That's good. It was a mumble, but you got it. You got it. Always remember to buy lunch for people who are more knowledgeable than you, richer than you, people who have helped you along in your career. Make sure that you do that every month. After 1 year, your circle of friends will have generated tremendous value for you. Your reputation, influence, and added value will be clearly recognized. You'll enhance your image of being kind and generous. That's good advice. Somebody said kind of twisted. Now, I'm all for networking, and I think it's so important to seek advice and knowledge and wisdom from people who are more successful than you are. You can always be in a posture of, I can learn something here. But something about that kind of rubs me the wrong way. Because if I'm only buying lunch for people who I can get something out for myself, whether it's social capital or a better reputation, then am I really practicing the kind of hospitality that Jesus is talking about? People shouldn't be a means to your own personal end. And hospitality that I offer to a stranger should not be from the promotion of my own self-interest. That's the world we live in, right? And so Jesus challenges those seated around this table of hostility with a vision of hospitality that's both humble and inclusive. And he first reminds them of this simple truth. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And what Jesus is saying is that there is a great reversal at work in the world. And the question is, what side of history will you be on? Will you follow the way of humble service? Let that be the culture that you create around your table. Is that what you're going to be following, or is it going to be something else? You don't have to have the finest china. You don't have to make sure that people are seated in the right place. You don't have to have the finest cuts of meat to show off how much you can afford. But simply set the table, offer what you have, and enjoy the company of guests. Keep it simple and keep it humble, but also keep it inclusive. Jesus tells his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brother or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbor. I don't think he's saying don't think about these kinds of people in your life. Obviously, he's saying that it's very important to love your friends and your family members and your relatives and all this kind of stuff. But his focus here is this. If you do, they might invite you back so that that you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. The poor, the crippled, the lame, even though they can't pay you back in whatever ways in which you want to be paid back, that's not the point. The point is for you to extend your table to include those who are on the outside. And it's no surprise that Jesus' guest list, includes the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind as these honored guests, because it lines up with Jesus' prophetic ministry. We're told in Luke's gospel that when Jesus was in the synagogue and he rolls open the scroll of Isaiah and he reads those words, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus came for the crippled, the lame, and the blind, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of God. That's what the kingdom of God is like. And so when Jesus casts this vision of hospitality, Jesus is being radically inclusive here. And he's saying that when you open up your home and you extend your table, to do so for those who can't just, aren't there to return the favor, but really to extend your table for the stranger, for those who you do not know, and those who may not be able to pay you back.
Because really, this love of the stranger is really the true heart of hospitality. In fact, the Greek word for hospitality is philoxenia, which is two words together. Philo, which is love, and xenia, which means stranger. And so it literally means to befriend the strange, to love the weird, the different, the stranger. And so to practice biblical hospitality is to befriend those who are strange. You know, we live in a culture that makes it really, really easy to avoid the strange. You and I can pick and choose the friends that we have. We can choose the neighborhoods that we live in. We can surround ourselves with all the people who look like us, who think like us, who believes like us. And it's easy to surround yourself with those who are familiar and kind of avoid the strange or sidestep the stranger. It's actually socially acceptable, you know? So, you know, when you have kids, what do you say? Stranger, danger. Stranger, danger. Don't talk to strangers. You know, don't get me wrong. Like, hey, it's important to keep a watch of your kids, yes. But it's socially acceptable. It's perfectly acceptable for us to say, you know what, it's easy for me not to get involved with that person who's kind of a little bit different. But Jesus is saying, love the stranger. I experienced the love of a stranger in a very profound way when I was a seminary student at Regent College. When I was there was a particular panhandler by the name of Ron, and he worked UBC campus a lot, and he was a kind of a big man, bushy hair, big beard. He had this coat that he wore all the time. He smelled very interesting. But he was one of those aggressive panhandlers, the kind of guy who is asking for change, and if you say, I'm sorry, I don't have it, he'll kind of follow you along. He was the kind of guy that, everybody knew on campus. Okay, when you saw him, you kind of crossed over to the other side of the road. And so one day I was going for a walk, and I was kind of going through a very difficult, challenging time in my life. I had a relational crisis thing that was happening, and so I needed to kind of clear my head, and so I said, I'm going to go for a walk. So I went out, and I started walking and circling the block of close to the school, and as I was walking around, Ron shows up, and he comes up to me, and he says, hey, do you got some spare change? And, I had my head down, and I looked up at him, and I said, no, sorry, dude, I don't have any money. And I really, literally didn't have any change in my pocket. And I don't know if it was because maybe the way I looked or the way I said it, but he kind of looks at me, and then he reaches into his pocket, and he pulls out a couple of coins, a quarter, a nickel, dime, whatever, and he extends his hand and goes, hey, go get yourself a drink. I'm like, okay. Wow, thank you. I was kind of blown away by that. I was like, no, I said, oh, Ron, thank you so much for that. I totally appreciate your gesture. And just to think that he would give me whatever is in his pocket so that I can go get a drink, I just was blown away. I said, no, thank you for that. I appreciate that. But I'll be fine. And then he looks at me again, and he looks at me in the eye, and he says, you just have to pray. I go, yeah, and it just kind of, I was a little stunned, But he spoke to my heart. He spoke to me. It was like, yeah, and I was like, yeah, I do need to pray. Oh, and I walked around the block some more, and I prayed. But it was such a blessing. This guy, Ron, this stranger who saw something. Maybe he saw some kind of pain that I was going through, and maybe he himself was a person very familiar with being estranged and what pain feels like, that he's able to see that in someone else and say, yo, here's what I have. Get yourself a drink. Trust in God. Pray. The love of a stranger. It's the spirit of hospitality. Hearing those words on that day was a blessing. And I tasted how good true hospitality is. It's not just about having the best food as much as we are a foodie culture, but it's about being and knowing the person that you're sitting across and that person's story and engaging in that person's life and being a blessing and praying for them. It's love of a stranger. This vision of hospitality as loving a stranger is what Jesus is saying. And it's not something new. It's actually very ancient in its practice. Jesus is tapping into something essential to what it actually means to be the people of God. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is renewing the covenant of God and making this covenant with his people and teaching them the way of God. And in chapter 24, he says this: "When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back and get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." And Moses continues, "When you beat the olives from your tree, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, for the fatherless, and the widow." Essentially, the teaching is when you, as a farmer, are harvesting your crops and you've forgotten to leave, to harvest a small portion on your olive tree or your vineyards, don't go back over it, but leave it behind for someone else who has need, who can come and glean from it and eat and have their daily sustenance. The teaching here is to share what you have with the immigrant among you, the orphaned among you, and those who are grieving among you. Be hospitable to the stranger. And here's the kicker. Here's the whole reason why Moses is even teaching this. Because remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I am commanding you. God's commandment to extend hospitality to the stranger is rooted in Israel's self-identity. You were once slaves, and I have brought you out. This is who you are. You were once slaves in Egypt, strangers in a foreign land. You were oppressed and in need. You cried out to God, and God heard your cry. He liberated you, and now He's bringing you into the promised land. And there will come a day when you will be doing supremely well in the land. There'll be a time when you're successful, and that day will come. And when that day comes, remember to care for the stranger, the estranged, the widow, the fatherless, because you yourself was that way estranged before. It's the central identity of what it means to be the people of God, that we were once lost and now that we are found, right? We practice hospitality because God has been extremely hospitable to us. Central to the gospel of Jesus is the reality that we belong to Jesus, not because anything that we have done to make us earn God's favor, but entirely because of the grace and mercy of God shown in Jesus that extends us and says, "You are now mine. You belong to me." With all of your warts and bumps and all of your weirdness and strangeness. Turn to the person next to you. You're weird, but I love you. It's okay to be weird. Those of you who love Portland, it's okay to be weird. God loves the weird. You know? We've been estranged and far off. We've been welcomed into the family of God through the cross. And this is what Paul reminds us in Ephesians when he writes, "Therefore, remember that formerly you were Gentiles by birth. Remember that you were at a time when you were separated from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope, without God in the world, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have now been brought near by the blood of Christ. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners, orphans, strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people as members of one household." We practice hospitality because at one point in our lives, and we were all outsiders at once. So we welcome the stranger because it's out of our self-identity. And hospitality, if we practice this, it can be life-changing. I love this quote from Henry Nouwen. He's a writer on the spiritual life. I love what he says here. He says, "Hospitality means primarily the creation of free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them the space where change can take place. It's not bringing men and women over to our side, but to offer freedom, not disturbed by dividing lines." I love that. The spirit of hospitality that just creates a space that's open and welcoming. I want to end with this story because I think when we practice this kind of hospitality, it'll change people's lives and it'll change the world, I think. It's the story of COSA, Circles of Support and Accountability. And this story begins back in 1990-something, and it begins with a sex offender, a pedophile of all persons, by the name of Charles Taylor. And you can see the picture of who he is on the left. And so Correctional Services of Canada has the authority of holding a person, the offending person, in prison until the very last day of their sentence, if they deem that this person is, running the risk of reoffending and highly, if there's a high-risk person. So they have the right to hold the person in the prison until the very last day. But the day eventually came where Charles Taylor was released. And so he served his entire sentence, and the hour was released in the mid-90s. And upon his release, he returned to his home. And when he returned to his home, there was a photo that was posted of him on the telephone poles, not necessarily welcoming home back to their neighborhood, but warning the entire population that there's this sick and twisted, dangerous pedophile returning to your community. Beware, this is the person. And so even though he might be a sex offender, he wasn't stupid. And so he left that town and he went to another town. And when the next town he went to, the police found out which town that he went to. And so they posted again, his photo again, to warn the people in that town that this person is moving into the neighborhood. Beware and just be forewarned. And so, again, town after town after town, he would leave and go to another town. And again, the notices were put up, kind of like a hunted animal. He's feeling estranged, lonely, feelings that can easily trigger reoffending. But then he remembers the name of a pastor who some years prior visited him in the prison. And it was through a program called M2W2. It's men to men, women to women. And essentially what this is volunteers come and have one-to-one conversations and relationships with inmates who are in the prison, building on that relationship, hearing their life, giving spiritual counsel. And when they are released, follow them up and provide that place of community. And so through that program, Harry Nye, who is the guy on the right, would participate in this program, and he had met Charles when he was in prison. And so Charles picks up the phone and he phones Pastor, and of course Harry by this point heard of his situation because there was intense TV coverage around his life. And so what Harry did, this pastor, he invited Charlie to come over to his house for a meal. And so they had a meal together. And so the next day, Harry's son found Charlie's photo on the front page of the newspaper on the desk of his school. And Harry's son says, "Hey, that's Charlie. He was over at my house for dinner." And the teacher's like, "What the?" And so the teacher called the police and called Harry and kind of was, "What are you doing?" And essentially pressured Harry to kind of let Charlie leave town and go somewhere else. And obviously, Harry didn't want to offend his town that he was living in, Hamilton. He didn't want the whole city against him. But yet he was also deeply concerned about what would happen to Charlie if he had pushed him aside and if he kept on running. And so he called a meeting in his little church. And he gathered the people together and they discussed, what can we do? And the discussions went on for a long time, and I don't know the details of that conversation, but I'm sure there were probably concerned people. Can we do this? Should we do this? If we do this, how should we do this? What risk are we putting ourselves into if we do this? I'm sure there was on and on discussions about this, and this went on for a long time. Finally, a little old lady turns up at that meeting, and she says, "You know what? This church has been a blessing to me. I don't know where I would be if it were not for this church. You guys have welcomed me into this community. And so if we don't do this for him, who are we then?" And so with that, they really hunkered down and said, "Okay, what are we going to do?" And so they came to this decision that there were 7 days in the week, and then so they called 7 people chosen so that they would have to meet with Charlie 7 days of the week, and they essentially created this circle of support, but also of accountability, where they would support him in finding housing, making sure that he's able to, eat and make his way around, and they also made sure that he wasn't alone, all by himself. And suffice to say, through his entire life, Charlie never reoffended until his death in 2006. And so out of that experience, this whole concept of COSA, circles of support and accountability, was refined and really is spread across this land. And now over 140 circles of support and accountability are all across the nation, with rates of success about 90% that help people not reoffend. Because of why? They have a group of people who are willing to journey with that person, support, and care for them. Nothing is more powerful than a caring faith community. And we're called by God to create communities of radical hospitality, in the spirit of the one who came to welcome us who are estranged. And so my hope and prayer is that we all, the church, might be a community with open hearts, open hands, open homes that would welcome those who are on the outside, and through that change the world.